Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll explore the moment when James and Tu Diep invite Mr. Hoan to their home to share a simple family meal after his illness. A quiet dinner where no one talks about the past, yet every silence brings a family closer to healing. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what this moment will change next. Inside the small wooden house hidden among a quiet grove of bamboo, the air carried the gentle rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. The sound of wind brushing against the bamboo stalks blended with the soft clatter of utensils in the kitchen. Tu Diep moved calmly between the counter and the stove, her gestures unhurried, practiced, and careful. She was preparing a simple meal, nothing elaborate, yet every step reflected intention rather than routine. The pot simmered quietly, releasing a mild aroma that filled the narrow space, warm and familiar. James stood nearby, rinsing vegetables, his movements mechanical, his mind clearly elsewhere. After a moment of silence, Tu Diep spoke, her voice gentle and unforced, as if she were simply sharing a passing thought rather than raising an important subject. She mentioned that Mr. Hoan had only recently recovered from his illness, that his health had been unstable for a while, and that it might be a good idea to invite him over for a meal. Not a formal gathering, she clarified, just a simple family dinner. Her tone carried no pressure, no hidden agenda, only concern that came from observation and empathy. She did not look directly at James when she spoke, allowing him the space to receive the idea in his own way. James paused. The sound of running water continued as he stood motionless, hands resting against the sink. Her words lingered in the air longer than expected. He did not respond immediately, not because he had not heard her, but because the suggestion touched something unresolved within him. Memories surfaced without warning, old arguments, long silences, decisions that had left marks deeper than he liked to admit. His jaw tightened slightly, and he turned off the tap, drying his hands slowly as though buying time. He did not reject the idea, yet neither did he agree. His silence carried weight, filled with hesitation and an unspoken conflict between reason and emotion. Tu Diep noticed his stillness. She did not rush to fill the gap. Instead, she continued what she was doing, adjusting the flame beneath the pot, placing prepared ingredients neatly aside. When she spoke again, it was not to insist, but to explain. She reminded him calmly that regardless of the past, Mr. Hoan was still his father. Illness, she said softly, had a way of making people fragile, of stripping away pride and leaving only what truly mattered. Showing care after such a time was not about forgetting old wounds, but about acknowledging a bond that could not simply be erased. Her words were measured, respectful, never accusatory. She did not ask James to forgive, only to consider. James leaned against the counter, eyes lowered. He understood her reasoning, even agreed with it on some level, yet agreement did not make the decision easy. Loving a parent who had caused pain required a kind of strength he was not always sure he possessed. Still, he respected Tu Diep's perspective, trusted her judgment, and more importantly, recognized her sincerity. After a long pause, he nodded slightly. It was not an enthusiastic acceptance, but a quiet concession. He agreed to invite Mr. Hoan over, acknowledging internally that this small step might be necessary, even if he was not fully prepared for what it could stir. Later that evening, James sat alone, phone in hand, staring at the screen longer than he should have. The message he was about to send was simple, almost painfully so. No explanations, no emotional language, just an invitation to come over for dinner. His thumb hovered briefly before pressing send. As the message disappeared into the digital void, he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for years. The act itself felt heavier than it should have, not because of its complexity, but because of what it represented. He wondered how his father would receive it, whether suspicion would outweigh gratitude, whether silence would follow. In another house not far away, Mr. Hoan sat quietly by the window, the light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the floor. His health had improved, but traces of weakness remained, evident in his slower movements and frequent pauses. When his phone vibrated, he glanced at it absent-mindedly, expecting nothing of significance. Seeing James's name on the screen caught him off guard. He read the message once, then again, as if to confirm it was real. Surprise crossed his face, followed by a cautious flicker of hope. He had not expected such an invitation, especially not after everything that had passed between them. After a moment of reflection, he replied simply, accepting the offer, though uncertainty lingered beneath his words. Back at the wooden house, Tu Diep prepared with quiet attentiveness. She chose dishes that were light, easy to eat, mindful of Mr. Hoan's recent illness. Each choice reflected care rather than obligation. There was no sense of performance in her actions, no attempt to impress. She moved with the calm assurance of someone doing what felt right. James watched her occasionally, noticing details he might otherwise have overlooked. The way she adjusted seasoning subtly, the way she checked the food's texture, the way her concern extended beyond words into action. As evening approached, the sound of footsteps paused outside the house. Mr. Hoan stood at the entrance, hands loosely at his sides, listening to the faint sounds of life within. Laughter drifted softly, the clink of plates, the hum of conversation. He hesitated, unsure whether to announce himself or retreat quietly. The house felt warm, almost unfamiliar in its comfort, and for a moment he wondered if he truly belonged there. His hesitation was not rooted in fear, but in the fragile awareness that crossing this threshold might change something he could not undo. The door opened before he could decide. Tu Diep stood there, her expression open and sincere. She greeted him respectfully, bowing slightly, and addressed him as Dad, without hesitation or formality. The word struck him unexpectedly, catching him off guard. He had heard it before, but rarely with such natural ease. For a brief moment, he simply stood there, absorbing the sound, the warmth behind it. Emotion flickered across his face, subtle yet unmistakable. James appeared behind her, offering a restrained but genuine welcome. He invited his father inside, pulled out a chair for him at the table. His actions were careful, deliberate, maintaining a respectful distance while making it clear that Mr. Hoan was not an intruder. The atmosphere was quiet, but not tense. It was the kind of silence that allowed breathing room rather than creating discomfort. They sat down together, 3 figures around a modest table. The meal was simple, unpretentious, yet comforting. No one rushed to fill the silence with conversation. There were no forced smiles, no awkward jokes. They ate slowly, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. The absence of heavy topics was intentional, almost protective. No one mentioned illness, past conflicts, or expectations for the future. Instead, the focus remained on the present, on the shared act of eating together. Tu Diep broke the silence gently, reaching across the table to place food onto Mr. Hoan's plate. She reminded him softly to eat slowly, to take care of himself. Her word carried no hint of pity, only genuine concern. He nodded, following her advice, and for the first time in a long while, felt the warmth of being looked after without conditions. As he ate, Mr. Hoan became aware of a feeling he had not experienced in years, a quiet sense of belonging. The food tasted better not because of its flavor, but because of the company. Across the table, James watched silently, noticing how his father's movements had slowed, how illness had left its mark. Compassion surfaced unexpectedly, mingled with restraint. The evening continued in this subdued rhythm, the bamboo outside swaying gently, the house holding within it a fragile but genuine moment of reconnection, one that did not seek resolution, only understanding, as the meal carried on, unhurried, allowing space for whatever might come next. Mr. Hoan ate one bite at a time, not out of politeness, but because his body seemed to ask for slowness. Each movement of his chopsticks was measured, deliberate, as if he were carefully negotiating with his own strength. The food itself was simple, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress, but its warmth lingered longer than expected. As he chewed, he became acutely aware of the quiet voice that had spoken earlier, reminding him to eat slowly, to take care of himself. It had not been said with concern that weighed heavy, nor with pity that bruised pride. It had been spoken naturally, almost casually, as if such care were an ordinary thing. That realization struck him more deeply than he anticipated. For a long time now, meals had been functional rather than meaningful. He ate because his body required it, not because eating brought comfort. Often alone, sometimes distracted, he had learned to treat food as fuel, nothing more. No one had reminded him to mind his health in years, not gently, not without expectation. Doctors spoke in instructions, acquaintances offered perfunctory concern, but no one had spoken to him the way Tu Diep had, as though his well-being mattered beyond obligation. The awareness settled slowly in his chest, creating a weight that was neither painful nor heavy enough to cause distress, but soft, like something long dormant beginning to stir. The warmth crept in gradually. It did not overwhelm him, did not demand acknowledgement. It simply existed, quietly filling the spaces he had learned to leave empty. He felt his shoulders loosen without realizing it, his breathing growing steadier. Even the way he held his chopsticks changed subtly, his grip less rigid than before. For the first time in a long while, he was not counting time, not anticipating when the meal would end. He was present. The wooden table before him bore small imperfections, scratches, faded marks, signs of use accumulated over years. They were not flaws, but evidence of life. The house itself was modest, built simply, nestled among bamboo that swayed gently with the evening breeze. The faint rustling outside filtered in through open spaces, blending seamlessly with the quiet rhythm inside. Mr. Hoan found comfort in the sound. It reminded him of places he had once known, moments when life felt less demanding, less guarded. Across the table, James sat quietly, his posture composed, his expression controlled. To an untrained eye, he appeared indifferent, perhaps even distant. But his gaze betrayed him. He watched his father carefully, though subtly, careful not to make his observation obvious. He noticed how slowly Mr. Hoan ate, how his hands trembled just slightly when lifting the bowl, how his shoulders sloped forward in a way they never had before. Illness had left traces that could not be concealed, no matter how much dignity one tried to maintain. James felt something tighten inside him. It was not anger nor resentment, but a restrained ache he did not allow himself to examine too closely. He had grown accustomed to keeping such feelings buried, believing that emotional distance was safer than vulnerability. For years, he had trained himself to see his father as a fixed figure, unyielding, authoritative, distant. Seeing him now, smaller in presence, quieter in demeanor, challenged that image in ways James had not prepared for. He looked down at his own plate briefly, grounding himself, reminding himself to breathe evenly. Sympathy was dangerous territory. It could soften boundaries he had built carefully, boundaries that had protected him from disappointment. Yet he could not deny the change in front of him. His father was not the man he once feared or resented. He was simply a man who had been ill, who was recovering, who sat at a table receiving care without resistance. James lifted his gaze again, allowing himself to observe without judgment. He did not rush to label his feelings. Instead, he let them exist quietly, unspoken. The room allowed for that kind of restraint. No one demanded explanation. No one asked for reconciliation. The silence between them was not heavy. It was patient. Eventually, James spoke. His voice was calm, steady, devoid of emotional emphasis. He asked whether the food suited his father's taste, whether it was comfortable for him to eat. The question itself was simple, almost mundane. It did not address the past, did not acknowledge illness directly. Yet it carried significance far beyond its wording. It was an opening, not a confession, not an apology, but an invitation to engage without defense. Mr. Hoan looked up, momentarily surprised. He had not expected the question, not because it was intrusive, but because it was gentle. He met James's eyes, searching briefly for something, perhaps judgment, perhaps distance. Finding neither, he nodded. He replied that the meal was very good. His voice was unhurried, sincere, stripped of formal courtesy. He did not exaggerate his praise, nor did he minimize it. He simply spoke the truth as he felt it. As he spoke, Mr. Hoan felt an unfamiliar calm settle within him. He realized that gratitude did not require dramatic expression. It could exist quietly, conveyed through tone rather than declaration. He returned to his meal, eating with more ease now, the earlier tension fading into the background. Tu Diep observed all of this without interfering. She sat slightly angled, her posture relaxed, her attention attuned to the atmosphere rather than the details of conversation. She understood the fragility of moments like this, how easily they could be disrupted by well-meaning words. She chose silence deliberately, allowing the interaction to unfold on its own terms. The three continued eating, the space between them filled with a quiet sense of mutual presence. No one attempted to bridge the past through explanation or apology. Instead, they allowed the present to exist as it was, unpolished, tentative, yet undeniably sincere. The warmth in the room did not come from closeness forced too quickly, but from the absence of resistance. Mr. Hoan found himself lingering longer than usual. He noticed small details he might otherwise have overlooked. The way Tu Diep adjusted the placement of dishes so they were easier for him to reach. The way James occasionally glanced up before returning his attention to his food. These gestures were subtle, unannounced, but meaningful. They did not demand acknowledgement, yet they conveyed care all the same. For Mr. Hoan, this was unfamiliar territory. He was accustomed to being respected, obeyed, perhaps even feared, but not quietly cared for. The realization stirred something tender inside him, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He did not know how to respond to it, and so he did not try. He simply allowed it to exist. As the meal neared its end, the pace remained unhurried. No one rushed to clear the table. The bamboo outside continued its soft murmur, the sound steady and calming. Tu Diep glanced at James, her expression softened by quiet reassurance. She did not smile openly, nor did she seek affirmation. Her gaze carried understanding rather than expectation. James met her eyes briefly. In that exchange, unspoken yet clear, he acknowledged something within himself. He understood now, perhaps more clearly than before, that loving his father did not require erasing the past. It did not mean denying pain or pretending that wounds had never existed. It meant accepting complexity, the coexistence of memory and compassion, of distance and care. This understanding did not bring resolution. It did not promise reconciliation or absolution, but it offered permission. Permission to feel without obligation, to care without surrendering truth. As the evening settled around them, the three remained seated a little longer, the silence comfortable, the warmth understated but real. Nothing was concluded, nothing was declared, yet something had shifted, quietly, irrevocably, as the moment lingered, carrying with it the fragile beginning of healing, not loud enough to be celebrated, but steady enough to endure, leaving the door open for whatever might come next. After Mr. Hoan recovers from illness, Tu Diep gently suggests that James invite his father to their small wooden home for a simple meal. Though burdened by past wounds, James agrees, honoring duty and love. The invitation unsettles Mr. Hoan, who arrives hesitant yet hopeful. At the modest dinner table, Tu Diep's quiet care and respectful gestures soften the atmosphere. No one revisits old conflicts. Silence replaces confrontation. As Mr. Hoan eats slowly, reminded to protect his health, he feels a warmth long absent from his life. James observes his father's frailty and, without grand words, asks if the food suits him. This simple question opens a fragile path toward understanding. The family shares a rare moment of peace, realizing healing does not erase the past, but begins by facing it together with patience, restraint, quiet courage, and enduring honesty.